Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to unpack all these crazy developments in our mad world. So there's a lot of disorder around us, and there are more than enough fingers to point and blame to be cast. Is this global disorder caused by neoliberals? Is it caused by neo-populists? Is it caused by neoconservatives? Is it caused by libertarians? So far, those are all the people on the right that we can blame. But can we blame progressives on the left also for, in a way, disordering the world, having incoherences in their vision of the global economy, incoherences in their vision of foreign policy? And this is something that we really haven't delved into too much on this pod, because we've been pointing the blame really at neo-populists on the right. And we haven't delved into what it is that on the left and center left we can do to have a more orderly vision of the world. And I think that this topic is more pressing because of the position that we find ourselves in after October 7th. And after many on the left in the United States and on college campuses and in central London find themselves upset with the center-left position of supporting Netanyahu's adventurism and human rights violations in Gaza, that the incoherence of the center-left of the Anglo-American foreign policy establishment has really been revealed based on this war in Gaza, where our Israeli allies have let us down by not pursuing a coherent, globally coordinated foreign policy, and one that has led to a range of humanitarian violations. And what has Biden or even Keir Starmer had to say? Not so much, not withholding arms, but also not clarifying what the American and British vision for example, the post-war governance of Gaza is. So it's against that backdrop that I would like to tackle this topic of what is a progressive foreign policy. I am really fortunate to be talking today with someone who spent a lot of time thinking and writing and working on these issues. And this is Megan Stewart. She is an associate professor at the University of Michigan. She's an international relations scholar, and her award-winning research focuses on the intersection between social inequalities and civil war, with a particular emphasis on national liberation movements and decolonizing wars. We're speaking to Megan now because Megan's paper, which was co-authored with Jonathan Petkun and Mara Revkin, entitled The Progressive Case Against Retrenchment, is out now in Foreign Affairs, and the link is in the show notes. And Foreign Affairs is the blue chip American foreign policy magazine to reach a lay audience, but it has a real impact in terms of how a Democratic administration that's coming in would think about how they deal with the left in their party. And I want to make a differentiation before we start here. Yes, in this podcast, as I mentioned, we've attacked neo-populists, neoconservatives, neoliberals, libertarians, but I don't tend to attack the hard left and blame them for the disorder. We're having Megan on because she attacks the very hard left progressives who don't want the West to do any ordering. They're so anti-imperialist that they can't see the West playing any role in ordering. They want retrenchment, which means withdraw. She is making a case against retrenchment, although it is still further to my left, because she's very concerned with the existing American laws and the existing international legal structures, which I might see as being dysfunctional. I want to more remake them. Megan just wants America to honor its own laws and honor international humanitarian law. I don't see that as sufficient because I think America needs to do ordering and can't just, say, well, we can't do this because it violates this, that, or the other. So, Megan, welcome to Disorder.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Megan, before we talk about progressive foreign policy, if you were trying to explain to a Scandinavian or an Italian what is a progressive in America and what are progressives in their political spectrums, how would you explain it?
I would explain a progressive in the United States as being on the left to mean very interested in economic redistribution, higher tax rates, and focused on social and political justice. So this would be, in my mind, similar to somebody on the center left in Sweden, perhaps, but in the US would tend to be a little bit more on the left-hand side. Also some public ownership of utilities, but also public options, public health care for everybody, but private options as well. That's what a progressive in the US might be.
Excellent. And in fact, it sounds quite European. In other words, the progressive is someone who believes in a rather large role for the state in correcting these historic injustices. And in correcting historic injustices and having a state that has state capacity, do progressives have a vision about the role of the West or the role of the United States in remaking a more equitable world?
I think they have some sense about the West and the United States as being empires historically. And part of the progressive world vision is an anti-imperialist one, so getting rid of empire. Aside from that, they would also think about reducing war and reducing military intervention, and then similarly would share their economic and political egalitarianism for all peoples globally.
So, given this background, we kind of have a vision of what it means to be a progressive. What is progressive foreign policy, both in the United States and in Europe? And can there be progressive foreign policy in, for example, places like Japan or South Korea or Chile? Talk us through that.
Totally. So the way that progressive scholars have thought about progressive foreign policy is typically three broad principles. The first is anti-imperialism. Some have called it anti-hegemonism, which is essentially you want to get rid of patterns of domination, subjugation, or exploitation between one strong state and a weaker state. There's also anti-war. So in general, we want to try and resolve conflicts or issues without resorting to violence whenever possible. And then finally, there's the broader goal of political and economic egalitarianism. And so any country, hypothetically, could have these broad commitments and could strive for these commitments. The question really is, how do we meet those principles? And I think that's where most of the disagreement tends to lie. So at least in the US space, a lot of US scholars and practitioners who would claim to be themselves progressive believe that fundamentally the core, perhaps what you would say, disorderer of the world is the United States. And so the way that you would achieve some of these policies is to restrain the US, to retrench, and to pull back.
I want to push back here. One, I think it's an insane contention that the core disorderer is the United States. And I don't understand progressive foreign policy thinkers as thinking that. Like I think of a Samantha Power, the whole liberal interventionist school, where they think that maybe the U.S. has made mistakes, but that the U.S. is the fundamental pillar of the global system post-1945. But I agree that on the more extreme left, the AOCs and Ilhan Omars of the world, they may see this very anti-imperial hard left, which sees the U.S. as a core problem in the international system.
Yes. So I would say that at least this is almost quoting verbatim from somebody who is writing about what progressive grand strategy or progressive foreign policy means. They have explicitly said that the U.S. is one of the, or basically the primary driver of insecurity globally. And so retrenchment and restraint is the natural answer to that.
Wow. So then this is extremely interesting. For our listeners who can't see Megan, she is a little bit younger than me. So I would say that she's a millennial and I'm a Gen Xer. I find that almost Corbynista in its approach and very, very dangerous. In other words, we here at Disorder are really worried about the capture of British, American, and European states by neo-populist disorderers on the right, but we're very equally worried about the Corbynistas and crazy anti-system, usually Putin-supporting left-wingers that have grown in popularity in the last 10 years. So I have to say I feel very uncomfortable if progressive foreign policy thinkers are thinking that the United States is something that needs to primarily be restrained. Although I accept that many of the protesters who are out in central London and university campuses protesting about Gaza probably do feel that. But Alex Hall and I would say that we're thinking that they're missing the mark and that the post-hegemonic world that they want to bring into being will be quite a disordered one when Russia and China are ruling the roost.
Yes. So we agree, or at least my co-authors and I agree, that there are some troubling aspects of a foreign policy that's rooted in restraint or retrenchment as sort of the default for the U.S. And just to define that a little bit more, what that means is scaling back U.S. commitments overseas. It's scaling back U.S. presence overseas. It's especially shuttering several military bases around the world and minimizing or reducing the U.S. role in a global economy.
Why would we want to minimize the U.S. role in a global economy? I mean, I am someone who thinks that Obama was in the right direction. We needed to curb the excesses of W. Bush's profligate and insane interventions abroad. But we'd also like to be producing cars and silicon chips and widgets and have great trade and exports with our allies. Why would we want to be reducing the American role in the global economy?
So the existing set of arguments are essentially saying that the U.S. is part of a broader global system where businesses and its sort of economic interactions are creating and perpetuating harms and exploitation around the world. Certainly, the U.S. has participated in that in the past. What my co-authors and I are thinking about, or one of the challenges that we're thinking about, is that if we retrench and if we restrain, do we also lose out on working towards other forms of progressive policy goals or policy ambitions? Just basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
That's a really nice way of putting it, Megan. We need to worry about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, there have been some injustices and interventions abroad, but America, at least to my mind, has been more a force for good than a force for ill. And certainly our economic might and muscle has lifted, maybe 1 billion people out of poverty and created the rules-based system. We've maybe let that slide in the last 20 years, but I don't know why we would want to retrench America's coordinating power. The amazing thing about the period of, say, 1946 to 2003 was that the U.S. was the coordinator par excellence. If there was a civil war in, pick a place, Latin America or Africa or Asia Pacific, we could get the parties together. We could smash heads together. We mostly could use sanctions and working with our allies in that region or whatever to try to have an equitable outcome or end the war. And now we may not even be able to convene the powers. And in a whole range of conflicts from Libya to Syria to Myanmar, we're not even one of the top 5 players, and we're not the place that the parties would go to mediate. They'd go to Qatar, or they go to Egypt, or they might go to Russia or whatever. And that, in other words, that we've withdrawn to this point that the peace conference and the economic levers lie in Russia or the UAE, I can't see how that benefits anyone.
What other progressive scholars and researchers might say is that while the U.S. might have been coordinating in the past, they were coordinating on possibly militaristic actions, which ended up perpetuating harm and violence, which ended up producing turmoil in other countries. They could be coordinating on war efforts in Iraq. They could be, yes, people might have been lifted out of poverty, but it came under or with labor conditions that were terrible. So the argument basically that others are articulating is that by reducing the U.S. role, you will get less of the economic pain, the sometimes physical pain caused by direct violence, and therefore retrenchment, again, their argument is, and restraint is a way to move towards a more just landscape.
So I get that argument. I don't agree with it. It seems very Corbynista to me in that it's just playing instantly into Putin's hands. Oh, the West has been seeking to maximize its own advantage. It's made all these mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan and blah, 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 blah. We've caused harm. But the Wagner Group is busy chopping hands off in Sudan and in Chad. Our policy of restraint is essentially just going to let our allies down and lead to a non-moral world.
That's exactly what myself and my collaborators are trying to argue, which is that in some cases and in some ways, restraint by the U.S. could actually undermine progressive principles. And I think Ukraine is a perfect example of this. Without U.S. military support, without support from NATO for Ukraine, we enable Russian imperialism. And it's an imperialism that likely might not stop at Ukraine and could continue elsewhere. So if we were to restrain, that would enable imperialism, which is precisely against progressive principles. Similarly, another good example of what might happen if the U.S. were to restrain itself and retrench is that Syria and the U.S. work with our partners, the Syrian Kurds. So in order to defeat the Islamic State, the U.S. worked closely with Syrian Kurdish forces and was able to successfully push back the Islamic State, which committed genocide against the Yazidi people, and basically has conducted anti-Islamic State operations since the mid-2010s in cooperation with the U.S. If the U.S. were to withdraw its support from the Syrian Kurds, which is, again, a very, very light footprint, it would create more space for Russia and Iran, which is partnered with the Assad regime. And also, the Turkish government has engaged in militarism and intervention or invasions into northern Syria, where the Syrian Kurdish forces are operating. I would similarly point to a case in Brazil where anti-democratic counterparts were organizing against Lula, and the U.S. was very clear in its support of a leftist, progressive leader in Brazil and worked closely at the request of Brazil to mitigate these anti-democratic elements within Brazil. So if the U.S. is not playing a role in some cases, it can lead to outcomes that go against the very progressive foreign policy goals we seek to see in the world.
And we've seen this happen already. Obviously, Trump's withdrawal of support from the Kurds and arguably Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan has led to various humanitarian crises, but also the implosion of economies and the harming of our geostrategic interests. But to reframe what you're saying, I think you're pointing out a key issue that is a problem not just for the left in the United States, but in Britain and in Europe, which is that on the left, we've seen a lot of the mistakes that our leaders of both parties, it's important to keep in mind that Labour under Blair supported the Iraq War, and Cameron was helping NATO in Libya, and they botched the reconstruction there. So there's no left-right dimension here. And a Biden approach to Iraq, Afghanistan is very undifferentiated from a W. Bush or Trump approach. So we need to say that this is an issue of Western foreign policy over the last 20 years. The hard left has said that the response is what you're going to call restraint, or this bizarre buzzword retrenchment, meaning just to withdraw from our imperial overreach as it would be conceived by the hard left. You made these great examples that Ukraine, Syria, Brazil, the Rwandan genocide, leading on the climate, all show that the West provides indisputable leadership. And when we withdraw, worse actors rush in. So that is 100% straight up the gut of how we look at these issues here on the Disorder podcast. If we don't try to order things, or at least coordinate with other powers, there isn't going to be a coherent international community and there won't be any ordering. So where does this leave us? That there are problems when American establishment thinkers try to do this ordering. You know, we've had excesses, we've made mistakes, but when we don't do it, no one steps in to coordinate the allies and no one does the ordering. Where does this leave us, Megan?
Where I'm coming at this is that the problem isn't the US per se. We think that essentially what the US has is a preponderance of power, and we think about power as a tool that could be used for good or for ill. And so it's a matter of conceptualizing power and using it in ways that we think align with progressive principles. So we totally agree on the progressive principle goals of anti-imperialism, anti-war, and political egalitarianism. But without the framework of the US specifically is the problem, thinking more about it as there is power. How do we use power in a way that moves us towards this just egalitarian end and away from the abuses, the harms, the atrocities of the past?
That's all well and good. It's looked at from a kind of 30,000-foot God's eye view. You know, how can we make the world better? But what if someone says, I haven't heard you use the word US interests or Western interests. In other words, great, you know, it would be nice to have the world be a better place. But, you know, we're sitting here in Michigan or we're sitting here in Newcastle. We need to be paying attention to Anglo-American interests. I have a kind of Platonic view that the good is good for everyone. But that isn't necessarily the argument you've put forward. Tell us, how does this play for fundamental Anglo-American interests?
Well, a lot of research on international relations talks about the role of legitimacy. And even though kind of the logic that we're laying out is more a logic of justice, it's a normative logic rather than a sort of strategic interest logic, we still believe that by following a normative logic, it has strategic interest in the sense that if you're leading by example and you are not engaging in harms, mass atrocities, the US is a formal empire, for instance. If you lead by example, you will be able to draw people in on your side and people will want to support and work with you. So we do think that there's strategic interest in the longer term.
Okay, so we're talking about the moral legitimacy of American and Western actions and who we ally with abroad. You know, obviously, whether it was working with the Viet Cong or Pinochet, or some people might feel the Israeli leadership, there are some problems in who the West has allied with for our strategic interests. And, you know, this is the issue of taint and hypocrisy. So how do progressives contextualize how we should handle this?
One way that we are thinking about it in our writing is not that we should not have partners. It's not that we shouldn't engage with others overseas, but it means taking seriously that partnership aid, and especially military aid, if used in ways that lead to harm, mass atrocities, and casualties, the US or others are complicit in that violence. And if that is the case, a progressive foreign policy is one that abides by our own laws, which is that if our weaponry, if our aid is given and it's used to commit violence, then that aid needs to be conditioned and withdrawn. It doesn't mean that the partnership is over, but it just means that the weaponry and other sources of support will be held off.
And I can see that this train of thought seeks to create more legitimacy for Western partnerships abroad. I'm worried about double standards. Obviously, there's millions of protests that are going on about we shouldn't allow the Israelis to buy weapons in Britain and America. But when weddings were being bombed in Yemen, almost no protests about the massive arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Obviously, more people were killed in the Yemen conflict than are going to be killed in Gaza, but no one protested, and hence there was no conditionality or changes there. How do you handle that issue of double standard?
Well, we think there should be conditionality in Saudi Arabia. So we would just get rid of the issue of double standards by applying our laws broadly and upholding those laws for ourselves.
And how do we do that when we have such critical equities with places like Saudi and the UAE that if we would all of a sudden stop selling them weapons, the Russians and Chinese will just sell them weapons, and all of a sudden the geostrategic moment or the balance of the geostrategic order will tip enormously in Russia and China's favor. Saudi, the UAE, and Qatar are essentially three of the most important swing states in the entire global system, right? It would be difficult to argue that if the United States and the West lost our alliances with both or all of the UAE, Saudi, and Qatar, and they became core Russian and Chinese allies, that we would still be having dominance in the world, right? We would have lost American dominance.
Perhaps if that's the sole source of our relationship is just weaponry, then an ally or a partner tends to work both ways, tends to have mutual benefit. So we would want to make sure we're upholding our laws broadly across multiple partnerships. And we think that partnerships are not just transactional, that they're based off of longstanding relationships and interactions. So if withdrawing or conditioning aid until our allies are more aligned with just basic international humanitarian law and basic human rights practices with the use of those weapons, if that's the sole cause of the end of a partnership, then there wasn't a particularly deep and meaningful partnership. But we think that these longstanding relationships, these interconnections go beyond just transactions. And so, yes, they might seek weapons or support elsewhere, but I think it is unlikely that just because of this one kind of instance, they would totally abandon the U.S. forever, and the U.S. would completely lose all influence and relationships.
After the break, what does a progressive foreign policy tell us about ordering the disorder?
Things change, but Deer Park Natural Spring Water is a constant you can count on, bringing you the essence of home for 150 years and counting. Sourced from carefully selected springs, Deer Park Natural Spring Water has naturally occurring electrolytes for a crisp, refreshing taste. Find Deer Park Natural Spring Water at your favorite local retailer today. After 150 years, there's only one thing left to say. Deer Park, that's still good water.
Okay, so progressive foreign policy. You've kind of sketched it out for us. You pointed out that the different goals like anti-imperialism and retrenchment and equity and equality, these may be in contradiction with each other, and that to order the disorder of the global system, we can't necessarily just be like, oh, we're going to try to do all these things all at once because we need to have a hierarchy here. So is order a progressive foreign policy goal? Having global order?
I think ultimately, yes. However, I think there's nuance, there's caveats. I think a lot of it is about process as well, and who gets to define what order is and what that means to people who are living with it. So I think, for instance, a progressive foreign policy would be very supportive of institutions that I think you might consider to be ordering institutions like the United Nations. However, progressives like myself look at the UN and think this is not actually, especially the UN Security Council, this is not representative of countries that are experiencing, that are often are being intervened upon. And where is their kind of seat at the table? Where is their ability to have a dialogue in this? So I believe that there is some sort of order, but how that order is constructed, who gets to play a part in it, who gets to speak and share their voice might be a little bit different from how others have kind of thought about ordering in the past.
It sounds to me like your goal is not so much order but issues of equity, issues of legitimacy, issues of maybe empowering women or formerly oppressed and colonial populations, I'm less concerned about that, because I would say that if we order the international system, it's going to be best for everyone. And if we have a disordered international system, it's probably going to be worse for the formerly colonized and for women and for LGBTQ plus and for everything. Do you know what I mean? And that if we focus on these like identity, politicsy based stuff, we're definitely not going to end up with good outcomes for people. That this is just going to be putting the cart before the horse and working on specific tactical gains where those gains happen, but in a disordered international system, which will be, horrific for people. So that's why here on this disorder program, we certainly believe in hegemonic ordering. And the idea of being anti-hegemonic is something that not only makes me uncomfortable, I see it as extremely naive. That if you read human history, whenever there hasn't been a hegemonic orderer, we end up with things like the 30 Years' War, or, the interregnum in the Ottoman Empire and the Middle Ages. And, what I mean? The global system has really only functioned when there have been, hegemonic global or regional powers that are doing ordering. And I want to ask you then, so given, your work and the people that you are talking with in DC and in the academy and within the democratic foreign policy establishment, how are they seeing that we can create mid-21st century hegemonic order, which is going to have to be with our allies?
Absolutely. I think the way that we are thinking about this is not having no allies, no partners, but rather making sure that when we're forming relationships, they're mutually beneficial, they're respectful of one another, and means that the institutions that we have, not necessarily getting rid of them, but making sure that they're more reflective of the people who are participating in them. It means that we are thinking carefully about when and where military force is used, and what we think would be to use it sparingly so that we don't have the potential for additional spillovers of violence, which could lead into disorder, which could lead into kind of pain and suffering of others. And it certainly means leading at home on the political egalitarianism, but then we don't want people to starve and die in pursuit of these political and social equality. The bottom line is that we want people to live and not to be harmed at the expense of pursuing these kind of political and economic goals.
Great. I mean, it obviously all starts at home. We started this podcast by having Timothy Garton-Ash on, and he certainly explained that order begins at home. If the U.S. is a disordered mess on the verge of civil war, and we can't even agree what color the sky is, how can we possibly lead a coalition to order the international system? And if we're not investing in green energy and preparing for the energy transition and, thinking about regulating AI in the US, how can we begin to tackle the global regulatory challenges? We can't, because we haven't even dealt with the issues of unregulated cyberspace in the US, let alone thinking about how to have a coalition to regulate cyberspace and AI abroad. So it's starting at home and then building out from at home to within our allies and then within the West in general and then our non-Western partners and whatever. It obviously has to expand outward. What are the steps that we can do? If you wanted to order the disorder with me, Megan, what's one thing that you would start doing first?
The first thing is that the U.S. is a formal empire. So one of the things that I think is really important is opportunities for self-determination for the territories. And I used to live in DC, so DC statehood to me falls very part and parcel into that realm. We can't say that we are providing aid to Ukraine as part of a broader anti-imperialist effort if we ourselves are imperialist or we are an empire. So that's part of it. In terms of anti-war, we think that we should also, you mentioned violence in the US, we should take very seriously, I think, the role in which US violence has caused harms, has caused violence elsewhere in the world, and to think what are the specific conditions under which that might be useful, but keeping in mind that having a defense And a strong and robust defense and sort of system of alliances can actually deter war and deter aggression elsewhere, which is actually going to reduce war. It's also really important that we think about how force under certain conditions can sort of mitigate harm and protect human lives, but also that there's a very serious possibility that could be worse. So thinking about the conditions under which, the very, very limited conditions under which we might use humanitarian intervention of some kind. But then speaking at home, it means, getting our house in order, doubling down on democratic institutions. It means making sure those democratic institutions are robust, making sure that we're a leader on climate change at home, and that our climate finance must go well beyond what we've promised, let alone delivered. And we need to show the hypocrisy point, I think, absolutely undermines all of our claims to legitimacy and sort of the normative claims we want to make. And it's really important that everything that we say we want to do abroad, we are absolutely hitting that at home.
You seem to be what I would call a Wilsonian, Megan. What do I mean by that? In World War I, Wilson postulated these 14 points. We then had the Versailles Conference, and most of the 14 points never came into being. And tragically, Wilson suffered ill health, and then the U.S. Senate never was able to get the League of Nations treaty over the line. But he really believed in self-determination, that if we were going to have an ordered world system, every self-defined people would get to have their chance to have a vote. Did they want to have a state? It's a very state-based idea that the state is the household of the international system, and any people gets to have its own household. I find it extremely fascinating that you say that DC statehood would help the U.S. Have more international legitimacy on this self-determination point. Whatever the status of Puerto Rico and Guam and Wake, I don't see how that has any bearing on our international creds to help the Ukrainians. I want DC statehood and Puerto Rican statehood because they have more population and more importance than Montana or Delaware or Rhode Island. And it's not fair for DC. Essentially, it is like the third most important place in the United States. And how could you not be voting for a senator there? But I don't know how that necessarily gives us street cred. What's the connection of these issues?
So historically, there's this fantastic book called Cold War Civil Rights, which basically argues and illustrates how during the Cold War, when the U.S. failed on its civil rights agenda, the Soviet Union was using that as a tool, as a recruitment tool, saying the U.S. promises these things and it's not delivering. It's not delivering at home. You can't trust them. And so we want to make sure we deliver at home. And we want to say with clarity, we're not an empire, and we are against imperialism. And the reason why it's really important to, at least historically, to push against empire, and this has been a historical core of progressive and center left and left foreign policy, is because empire is predicated upon using violence to dominate other peoples, to take away their political institutions and undermine their political institutions and culture. It also has involved economic extraction that benefits the dominating state at the expense and sort of lives and livelihoods of the people who are often forced to work for the empire or businesses from the empire. And so working against imperialism means, or at least it's thought of historically and today, as kind of pushing against patterns of political and economic subjugation and domination that do not benefit those affected most by those actions and behaviors. And so because that's a core pillar of progressive foreign policy, it means that the U.S. cannot be participating in those same actions abroad.
Megan, that's a very compelling and interesting definition of what an empire is. In other words, you define it as the use of structural violence for one state to gain an advantage economically or setting the terms of other power relationships over another state, and to destroy the other polities or states' authentic institutions. I don't know if I agree with that, though. And interestingly, I should have a more thorough vision myself because I hold a MST degree from St. Anthony's College, Oxford, in global and imperial studies, where we read all these different theories of imperialism. And that's not what I recall imperialism really to mean. I don't think empire requires force, and it certainly doesn't require the extraction of financial or economic or even military advantage. In fact, a lot of what British Empire was about was protecting the terms of free trade and protecting the global system. So much of British Empire, quote unquote, in Africa was done at a loss. And the exchequer paid for it, and they never saw that money back. It was just seen as something which needed to be done to maintain global order. So that's my first point about empire. But secondly, I agree with you that America is a formal empire, for sure. Since 1898, since the Spanish-American War, we've been an empire. We conquered Cuba then, we acquired Puerto Rico and Guam, and then the Philippines. We ruled the Philippines as a colony before it won its independence. But I don't think that that is what has hurt us abroad in terms of our image. It's other hypocrisies, for example, the misguided interventions and incorrect and unsustained reconstructions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and then not working enough on the reconstruction phase in Libya. Not the fact that Guam and Wake are held as territories. So I just want to differentiate all of this here. From my perspective, I'm just much more concerned with global ordering. And if you have to have a little bit of an empire to do global ordering, I'll accept it. And I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to care if we have Puerto Rico in a relationship which isn't that of a state, if we're giving them the arms that they need to fight off Russia. You know what I mean? That I'm very worried about systematizing things too much, because the problems with Puerto Rico, for example, or with DC, are just that there's a democratic deficit, not that it's an empire. Or the problem in a certain situation is that it isn't working, it isn't providing order, isn't providing economic growth. But yeah, those are my 2 cents on that. I think another interesting point that you make is to read from your paper. The point is that force may be justified on progressive grounds, and progressive foreign policy means grappling with the inevitable trade-offs and trying to minimize them. This is critical. All extremists on the left and the right can have an ideology which they say is morally pure, and then they're like fundamentalists, and they're not willing to deal with trade-offs. Those of us who are sane on the center left, we understand that there are trade-offs. You know, sometimes there's going to be times when you have to use force, and you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. So when do we need to use force to order the disorder abroad?
I would say that any sort of defensive position, if you're being attacked, you absolutely have an ability to use force. We believe that force just has to be in compliance with international humanitarian law and can participate in mass atrocities. So that's sort of one bucket. Another bucket today would be supporting force for what we would consider anti-imperialist reasons. So in this case, thinking particularly with respect to Ukraine and providing weaponry to Ukraine, that is totally in the wheelhouse of justified use of force. Again, as long as complicity in crimes of allies, the same would hold true in this case. So if we were supporting Ukraine and Ukraine is participating in mass human rights and international humanitarian law violations, that would not be a reasonable sort of use of force to support. But in general, today, supporting Ukraine absolutely falls within the progressive use of force for anti-imperialist purposes. And historically, in the past, lots of decolonizing wars against empire were conducted by using force and by using violence. And then the third way would be under much more limited conditions, I think, than somebody who might believe in liberal interventionism. Humanitarian intervention can save lives under very, very limited circumstances. And so one of the most skeptical analyses about the Rwandan genocide suggests that at worst and at minimum, the U.S. could have saved something like 75,000 Rwandan lives with a very limited military intervention. So there are other humanitarian interventions have increased violence, have perpetuated conflict, and have been applied kind of unevenly in different places around the world. We think that humanitarian intervention under very narrow circumstances, there's no other option, very limited mandate, there's accountability in sticking to that mandate, a humanitarian intervention can be beneficial in order to save lives. So those would be sort of the three general places where we would think that there could be progressive uses of force or uses of force that don't violate broader progressive tenets. And so defense, anti-imperialism, and humanitarian intervention, again, as long as it's consistent with international humanitarian law.
And it sounds like you really want a checklist approach to foreign policy making in the sense of like, do they do anti-imperialism? Check. Is the war defensive? Check. Is this something whereby we have a non-transactional longer-term relationship? Check. I get that, and I do think that there needs to be rules and international order. But for me, ordering is going to have to be more of a feeling, and it can't be defined. And that we're not going to be able to exit this pod without discussing to some extent the Israel-Gaza issue, because this topic, I think we would get tons of listeners saying, how could you talk about this topic without talking about, I don't know, the hypocrisy or Israel's right to defend itself or whatever? And I think it's an example of there can't be a checklist approach, because obviously sovereign Israeli territory was invaded, civilians were massacred, and then in response to this, the Israelis have done human rights violations and have not really thought about, how to prepare for the correct post-war governance of Gaza. I don't think two wrongs make a right. Where does this leave the progressive on foreign policy in thinking about what the role of the West should be in this conflict?
So certainly I agree essentially with everything that you said. Israel absolutely has a right to defend itself. Civilians were massacred by Hamas. And then thousands of Gazans' lives have been lost in a way that, to my mind, far exceeds what is necessary for defense. I would say that the U.S. needs to stick to its own laws on the books, which have been there for a while.
Such as
the Leahy laws, which mean that if U.S. weapons and aid are being used to commit human rights violations, that aid needs to be conditioned. It also means that the U.S. needs to support and mitigate the human rights disaster that's unfolding in Gaza right now.
So that's really interesting. I just want to push back. We give aid to Egypt. Obviously, the Mubarak regime and then the Sisi regime, they attack protesters. They've massacred Muslim Brotherhood people. They do human rights violations in their prisons. We don't condition the aid. So would it not be very, very problematic to all of a sudden just signal out Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be very, very problematic just to single out Israel. And so that's why I think we need to, in general, uphold our own laws like across the board.
Okay, Megan, I think that you are an orderer. The order that you are interested in may be a world in which there's less violence, there's greater equity, and there are greater protections for individuals and the nation, and that we as a species and a collection of nations and political communities are working together to face shared challenges relating to climate and cyber misinformation and civil war. So to end with two great quotes from your paper, you wrote, "Taken to an extreme, an undeviating policy of retrenchment and restraint can even exacerbate problems that threaten progressive goals around the world, including mass atrocities, authoritarianism, and imperialism or violence by regional rising powers, including Russia, China, and Iran." That's one quote. And again, from your mouth to God's ears. And the second quote, "Skepticism about the U.S. role in global affairs is absolutely warranted. The foreign policy status quo does not reflect the pursuit of justice, anti-imperialism, or the political, economic egalitarianism that progressives like ourselves yearn to see in the world. But focusing on a foreign policy of retrenchment does not solve all the problems progressives seek to address. Indeed, retrenchment can exacerbate long-standing unresolved problems and create new ones." Lot to think about out there, orderers. Little did you know it would be so complicated to order the disorder. If you've enjoyed our musings, please subscribe to our Substack for more content and background articles. And you could find the link in the show notes to Megan's excellent paper and some of her other writings. Our producer is George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. I've really enjoyed this conversation with Megan. And if you want more content like this, tap follow right now. And most critically, I command you to have an orderly week.